faces. Hi, Lorinda. Hi, Ashley. Yay, faces. Okay, great. All right, so welcome. We are going to jump into a really exciting topic today. Student development theory in program design and assessment, which I know is like everyone's favorite topic. We are jumping for joy over the enthusiasm. I nerd out over student development theory, over program design, and over assessment. So having the ability to talk about all of these three makes me super excited. I really love this. I love this topic. So we just really quickly, sorry, I'm trying to move like my chat around, and it's fine. Things are going to be fine. We are going to do a super quick poll just to help me to better gauge kind of where everyone's familiarity is with student development theory. So there's a few options here. Ashley just launched the poll, so you should see, how would you describe your knowledge of student development theory? Either not at all familiar with it, so you've never heard of it before. You know that it exists, so you've heard that phrase, but you're not familiar with specific theories. You might be familiar with specific theories, but haven't intentionally used them in your work in any way, or you're experienced in applying specific theories to your work, like in program design or assessment, even if it's just a piece of a theory. And if you are a theory nerd like me and you have a favorite theorist, feel free to drop that in the chat, because I love hearing about people's favorite theorists. I'm sure you'll figure out who my favorite theorist is as we go on today. We'll be kind of talking through some examples. But I am going to go ahead and get us started. Let's see. Here we go. All right. Know that it exists, but unfamiliar with specific theories is about half of folks. All right. And then familiar with theories, but haven't intentionally applied them. All right, great. That's really helpful. Thank you. So what we are going to do today, my slides will click. There we go. This is not going to be your graduate school conversation around, or class around, student development theory. It's not a crash course. We don't have a full semester to go over all of this. We've got about an hour and a half, and hopefully it'll also give you an opportunity to start practicing in using theory to write your own outcomes and to design some elements to programs that are unique to your areas. So for the purpose of today, what we are going to do is talk about the purpose of using student development theory in program design and assessment. Why do we use it, or why should we use it? How is it helpful to us? What type of rationale or guidance does it actually provide? We will also talk about some current challenges that are influencing student development, both from a theoretical framework and from just a what's happening in life right now framework. We will look at some student outcomes and start to identify appropriate outcomes and aligning those to student development theory. And then hopefully you will walk away today with the ability to design at least one aspect of a program, a service, an experience, a class, event, an activity, whatever it is that you do, but be able to design an aspect of that using student development theory. So there's a bit of a delay here. So like I said, we're going to start with just a quick overview of student development theory, just to hopefully get all of our knowledge, at least at a similar baseline. We will talk through a couple of different theories, just as examples as we go throughout, just to give you some background of, here's kind of some theory and what types of theories exist in the world. I do have a little cheat sheet that I actually got offline, and we use it in our office all the time because Google is a savior. And it's a great little cheat sheet of different types of theories. So if you're not sure where to start in your programs, I'll share that cheat sheet with you all a little bit later. And I'll also make sure all the documents I share with you, Ashley gets a copy of them so she can send them out to the group after. But this is great for just initial guidance of, here's where to get started. Here's kind of what each theory is. And it's not all encompassing. It's some of the more common theories we use in higher ed, particularly in student affairs, but theories are constantly evolving and changing because of the new research and as we're learning about different specific student populations. So it's a very broad overview we're starting with today. So the first thing I want to start with is just broadly student development theory. What is it? Why are we using it? What does it do for us? I love this quote. If any of you have taken a student development theory class in grad school, you probably use the Student Development in College textbook. And this quote comes from that book, and I love it. And this is like the justification for me of why we use it. Student affairs practice without a theoretical base is neither effective nor efficient. And that is because if we aren't using knowledge of any kind, and we're just saying, I'm gonna make this program, or I wanna make this activity just because I think it would be cool, how effective are we going to be in that, right? We might be able to toss an outcome out there, but we don't actually know if there's a way that we're going to achieve that. We haven't figured any of that out yet. And that's okay. But I think what this does when we're using theory in general, it helps us to make sense of life, is what theory does. And student development theory helps us to make sense of the student experience by contextualizing student behavior. And so it's helping us to understand and respond to student needs in an empathetic way, right? We can see what their experience is like, and we can kind of see what they're going through using this theory and using the research and the evidence. One of my least favorite words in the human vocabulary is anecdotally. I can't stand that word because we don't need anecdotes when we often have research and evidence that can support our reasons for doing things. We all have informal theories about students and the environments and human development in general. And that's generally based off of our own experience and our own perspectives and our own observations and our own interactions. That's that anecdote, right? The informal theory. But informal theories and anecdotes aren't self-correcting. We're not testing the accuracy of that in any way. So what student development theory, where there is research and there is some evidence, what that does is it offers the rationale for our programs, our services, our policies, our experiences, and so on and so forth. It's offering rationale for that, which helps us in so many different ways, right? How many times have we wanted to start a program and we've asked for resources, funding, staffing, whatever, and they're like, why? Why do you need it, right? We are running into that right now in our office. Why do you need those resources? Why do you want to start this program? What good is that going to do? Theory gives us that rationale. It provides some of that rationale for us. So we don't have to go out and survey students for the 100th time or do some focus groups or try to collect our own information. We have some type of basis to build off of. And so what that does is with our programs, that leads us to more effective outcomes. When we have a rationale, we have a basis, we have research and evidence about how a specific student population may be experiencing college in different aspects of college in some capacity, then when we're creating our outcomes for our programs, we can be more effective in those outcomes, meaning more students can achieve them. They can achieve them at higher rates, or we can write outcomes that require higher levels of critical thinking for our students. So thinking about Bloom's taxonomy pyramid of critical thinking, maybe we don't have to focus on that understanding piece if we know developmentally students are up more in that analysis and creation. So it can really help to kind of provide that rationale and drum up some of those outcomes and help with all of that. Generally though, when I think of theory, I like to think of it as a weather map, which might seem kind of silly, but hear me out. I think of theory as a weather map in 5 really unique, specific ways. 1, it describes what's happening. Our weather map is telling us this is what is happening in this moment. Right now in Westminster, Colorado, it's kind of sunny out, probably partly sunny. It's about 70 degrees, like it's a nice day, that's great. Student development theory tells us, here's what's happening with college students right now. Here's what's happening with college students who are in transition. Here's what's happening with college students who are trying to integrate socially and academically into their college experience. Here's what they're experiencing. Here's what's happening. Number two, it can explain the causes of phenomenon, or in the case of students, behaviors. I want to know why it's warm outside. Well, it's sunny. Like, that's why. I want to know, why does it feel cold? Why am I getting a headache on this cold, dreary day? Oh, that's because of barometric pressure that's coming in. Great. That's good to know. Similarly, with student development theory, we can explain why students are behaving in a particular way, depending on where they're at in that development stage, dimension, vector, step, what have you. There's many different names for all of the things that take place in theories. So we can look at those stages to explain why a student is behaving in that way. Really strong theories, student development theories with lots of research, lots of evidence that have been able to focus on a broader student population, can also predict an outcome. In the case of students, a developmental outcome. Just like a really good meteorologist can probably predict the outcome of a weather event, right? Although in our family, it's arguable. We argue meteorologists are like the safest jobs to have, because you don't even have to be right and you're still good. Like, you're still good at what you're doing and you get to keep your job. So yay for you. But you can say, like, okay, we're getting a massive blizzard. We can anticipate about 10 to 15 inches of snow, or we have really strong wind conditions that can probably produce tornadoes, or we're going to get some hail damage. And here's what you're going to see from that. Hopefully you have a really good insurance policy in place. Like, these are the things that can be predicted through maps and from our student experience and our student development theory. Number four, it is specific. Weather maps are specific to different locations, right? What's happening in Colorado, weather-wise, precipitation-wise, temperature-wise, is not the same that's happening in Maine. It's not the same that's happening in Australia, right? It's all going to be different. Similarly, with student development theory, it is very specific to the population that was studied. So many of the theories that we know about that relate to student development are based on specific populations that were studied. The vast majority of them that came before the 2000s really focused on studying white men, because historically, that's who higher ed was created for. So we have to consider those historical contexts within student development theory. Does that mean it can't be true and help guide us in working with other student populations? No, we can absolutely use that. But we need to be mindful of that when we are applying student development theory in our work. And then lastly, one size does not fit all. So just like with a weather map, some days I might need to know what the temperature is, but I might need to know what the temperature is in Maine if I'm going back home to visit family, but not in northern Maine, in central Maine, in Waterville, Maine. I need to know what the temperature is in whenever I visit them. And because it's Maine, I need to know if it's 40 degrees, but do I need flats? Do I need rain boots? Do I need to bring snow boots and a winter jacket? What do I need? So I'm looking at specific areas. I'm looking at different types. I might have to expand in those areas. Similarly, student development theory might require us to make some shifts. I might not need to look at a theory as a whole, but maybe one specific dimension or one specific stage of that theory is really applicable to the work that I'm doing with students right now, which is great. Or we might have to shift gears altogether and try a totally different theory. That's something we're running into right now at CU Boulder, where a lot of our programming and our student engagement outside of the classroom kind of follows Tinto's social integration model. However, students aren't engaging in the same way outside of the classroom. They don't have all the big events and the in-person activities or even the opportunities to meet within their clubs and organizations. They don't have those same things. And so they're telling us, we want that, we want that, we want that, we want that. but we're not giving it to them because, public health, COVID, there are reasons why they're not getting that experience. But to them, what they're telling us is, we don't matter to you. We're just a student. We're just tuition and fees. We're just funding your business, your operation. And so now we're shifting from engaging students through Tinto's social integration model to now thinking about Schlossberg's mattering and marginality theory. How do we help our students understand that they matter to us, that they matter to their peers, that they matter to faculty, that they matter to their advisor, that they matter to the dining staff? How do we help them understand that they matter, that they're seen, they're valued, they're appreciated, they're understood, they're heard, that we care whether or not they fail or succeed? How do we help them with that? So we've had to completely shift gears into that. Fortunately, we have theory to tell us this is what students want. When they say, like, we don't feel like we matter, we don't feel like you care about us, we know what mattering looks like to them because of the theory. We can use that as a framework to then target our outreach and our messaging to students, to adjust the types of programs that we're offering, to adjust the conversations and the interactions we're having with them in and out of the classroom. So we can shift gears in that way. So these 5 really specific areas to a weather map and student development theory, what this does is it really helps us to forecast and plan ahead for how to be proactive in our student engagement and how to respond to what their needs are before they have to come out and tell us, right? We don't want to find out after the fact and have to be reactive. Someone type out the 2 names she gave for theorists. Yes, and I can also provide a list of all the theorists. I can add them into the chat as we're working through some examples later too, because there's a lot of them. It's going to be great. So the one I just talked about was Tinto, Tinto, and Schlossberg. You'll actually see her name come up in a little bit, but Schlossberg, Nancy Schlossberg. She has a few different theories. Thanks, Ashley. Okay. So yes, we know a little bit about student development theory. We know how it can help us. However, there are some environmental or some more like external factors that can greatly contribute to or inhibit student development. So before I provide more of a theoretical framework for this, I'm curious to hear from you all. What are some environmental external factors that might be contributing to a student's development, particularly this semester? Any thoughts? Feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in or toss it in the chat. COVID, Ashley says. Yes, COVID. That like threw everyone for a loop, right? We're going to talk a little bit about Schlossberg's transition theory soon, and that is a perfect example of needing to like transition on the spot due to an event or a non-event in some cases. Homeschooling children, yes, having to take on more of those roles. So thinking about the adult learning theory, isolation, social distancing, unemployment, food insecurity. Oh my gosh, yes, food insecurity. We've been doing so much about that on our campus. Access to technology, yep. Military obligations, absolutely. Yes, all of these things are impacting our student experience. And whether or not we're aware of them, right? Some of them might disclose this to us. Childcare shifts, yep. They might share with us, you know, I'm running into these challenges, or this is my experience right now. More often than not, they don't, because they can handle it, right? They've handled everything else life has thrown at them so far. So sure, this is just another hiccup. It's fine. I'll get over it. I can work through this. Hopefully they rely on and reach out to the supports and our programs that will or are designed to support students experiencing these challenges, but sometimes they don't. So what are some things that we can consider from a theoretical framework in terms of developing our programs for students? So the first is Sanford's theory of challenge and support. I'm just going to summarize these theories in like one sentence or less. Challenge and support is literally that a student has an appropriate level of challenge and an adequate level of support. So they're not, yes, everyone's challenged, right? I'm going to challenge your thinking. I'm going to challenge your skill set. I'm going to challenge your time and energy management skills. I'm going to challenge your focus and your ability to show up somewhere at a scheduled time. I'm going to challenge a lot of things. But in order to help you rise to that challenge and not see it as overwhelming, I need to make sure that there's adequate supports in place to help you rise to that challenge, to help you meet that challenge, to help you stretch yourself enough to grow and develop. So what can impact this is if there's an inappropriate level of challenge where it's too hard for students and an inadequate amount of support, whether it's they don't have enough support in their resources or they don't have the right types of support in their, and it could be network, it could be financial, it could be employment, it could be family, it could be whatever, any type of support. It doesn't even have to be academic in this case. The second one is Aston's involvement theory. And this one is just describing students' access to involvement opportunities. Do they have the ability to get involved? Do they have the option to get involved on campus? Are there still club and organization opportunities? Are there still activities and events where they can connect with peers or with faculty and staff? Can they connect with mentors? Are there employment opportunities for those that were really relying on work study to try to help pay for their education? Are those opportunities still there? And if they are, how accessible are they to the individual? And I'm talking accessibility to expand on Aston's theory, accessibility in terms of like actual accessibility for students. Does it meet accessibility guidelines? And is it accessible for the active duty military service person who is also trying to balance that with taking classes? Or the mom who is now working from home and taking care of her kids because her daycare closed or her school is doing remote learning. And so she's also having to be a teacher on top of that and try to take classes and then try to get involved. Or students who are living at home with families and their culture dictates if you live under this roof, you're going to help provide for this family. So you're going to work a full-time job and take some classes. And if you want to do some involvement and stuff afterwards, that's fine, but that's not priority. That's what you get to do in your free time. Are these still accessible for our students? Schlossberg's marginality and mattering. I really think this is a strong theory in and of itself and has, I think, come to light a lot more in recent years, especially with so much more emphasis in identity development and mental health and addressing those types of concerns with students. So this marginality and mattering, Schlossberg says, is basically the extent to which someone feels like they fit in to the campus community. Do I feel like I fit in? Do I feel like I matter to someone on campus? A peer, a staff member, a faculty member, whoever. Do I feel like I matter? Do I fit in? Can I see myself here? I think a lot of us, when we chose our college, at least when I chose my college, I visited the campus and I walked up and I said, I can definitely see myself here. I can definitely see myself walking down this main road on campus, and I saw myself there. Do students see themselves on the campus? Both kind of hypothetically, and do they see themselves in the other students that are attending, in the faculty and staff who work there? Do they see themselves? And if not, there might be that more of that feeling of that marginality. And so how do we address that? And the last one that I think is honestly probably the most prevalent to, I think, community colleges in general, but any college that really serves a large non-traditional student population is Rendon's validation theory. And in Rendon's research, it was discovered that non-traditional students required more external validation of their academic skill sets than traditional students in order to become involved on campus, in order to enhance their self-esteem, and in order to believe that they have something to contribute to the academic community. They needed more of that external validation. And within that research, it was also found, there was evidence that that validation that takes place from those external parties, peers, faculty, staff, whoever, is most powerful when it's offered during the early stages of that student's academic experience, which is generally the first few weeks of classes. Can anyone think of something we do in higher ed that takes place generally within the first 3 to 6 weeks of classes that supports our students? Welcome week, yes. Yes, Gabriella, absolutely. Welcome week, that engagement opportunity, orientation, resource fair, yep. Learning students' names, yes. Yes, Lorinda, learning their names. What about an early alert program? Does Pikes Peak still have an early alert program? Yes, okay, great. Group projects, yes, yes. So think about an early alert program. These are all great examples. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to get into the application of this because these are going to be amazing. These are all great examples of how we connect with students, right? We're going to challenge them. We're going to tell them about all the resources that are available for support. Look at us, already addressing all of these factors. We're going to help them get involved. They're going to learn about the resource fair. Welcome week, they're going to meet with some peers. They're going to connect with people. Learning their names, getting them to work with others is going to help them feel like they matter. They're going to feel seen. They're going to feel valued. And then as we get to the first few weeks of classes and students start to struggle, we flag them, right? Early alert. We need to reach out to these students. They're struggling. The outcome of what we're trying to do through that early alert process is help connect students, find out what their needs are, connect them to the resources so that way they stay enrolled, right? That's what we're going to do. The way that we get students to use those resources when they're struggling, because that stinking thinking comes up, right? That negative self-talk of, I'm failing this class. I'm 3 weeks in. I shouldn't be failing already. Clearly, I don't belong here. I wasn't ready to come here. What am I doing? I am terrible at math. I'll never be good at math. Girls aren't good at math. That's not something I will ever be good at. I'm terrible at this. What was I thinking? I have all these math classes that I need to take for my nursing program. Right? These are the conversations that students are having either internally or with others. And so in our conversations with students, in the interactions that we're having with them, we're validating their reasons for enrolling. We're validating that you have the academic skills to be here, or you wouldn't be here. You have the ability to develop your knowledge and your skill set, because that's what college is all about. If we didn't think you couldn't do it, you wouldn't be in these classes. We wouldn't be reaching out to you if we didn't think you could do it. You belong here. You should be here. You have the skill set and you will continue to develop the skills to improve in this area. You do have what it takes. We're validating their existence on our campus and in our community. And by doing that, we can help shift that mindset for them so they do connect with those resources. So they do go to tutoring. So they do reach out to their advisors. So they do actually visit their faculty's office hours. So they do all of these things, which will hopefully help them to stay and to retain and to meet that academic goal and to graduate and maybe transfer on to a 4-year or maybe start out successfully in a career, right? These are all the things that we are trying to do. Look at all of the ways you all are already doing things to address the factors that could influence negatively the student development process. And now you have theory to support it all, right? So let's dive into some of the types of theories before we get into using them to actually develop a framework. So when we think about student development theory, we kind of break it down very roughly into these three groups, these three types. It is continuing to evolve, but it generally falls into one of these three areas. So we start out with these foundational theories. And so this is Chickering's theory of identity development, moral development theory, Kolb's theory of experiential learning. If you've heard of any of these theories, if you want to drop the names of the ones you've heard in the chat, just to give me some perspective, that would be great. But quick overview for those who are not familiar with all of these. And again, very quick overview. Chickering. When I was at Pikes Peak, Sylvia, thanks Sylvia, I still have my Chickering as my co-pilot pin. And she got me at a conference. It's just sitting on my desk in my actual office at Boulder. And I was frantically looking for it today, and I don't have it because it's there. I was hoping it was still here. But love Chickering. But Chickering's theory of identity development basically says there's 7 vectors of identity development that occurs over a span of time. It's not a specific span of time. Students move through those development vectors at different rates, and it accounts for their emotional, their interpersonal, ethical, and intellectual aspects of development, all within their identity. So it's not focused on the racial identity, gender identity, those pieces. It's looking more identity holistically. Who am I as a person? How do I show up in this world? That's really what Chickering is looking at. Moral development theory is really that, talking about how do students develop morals and how do they develop moral behavior and moral thinking. We see this used a lot in conduct offices and restorative justice programs to help students kind of move through those different stages. Great, yay. I'm just reading through what everyone's using. Awesome. Kolb's theory of experiential learning. This is one of my favorite theories because I feel like it's applicable to so many things. If there's a learning component to what you're doing, read up on Kolb's experiential learning theory if you're not already familiar with it. We're actually going to use an example with it a little bit later, but essentially it's saying that for students to truly learn a concept or a skill, they need to engage in doing that thing that they are learning about in order to most effectively learn it. And there's reflection processes and analysis and this abstract conceptualization that happens with it, but basically students need to engage. And we all know, we've heard about active versus passive learning, right? Kolb's experiential learning is like the epitome of active learning. So then we move into integrative theories. The theory of self-authorship is the whole premise of students writing their own story, right? Writing who are they going to become? What do they want to do with their lives? How do they want to show up in the world? So almost like an extension of Chickering. We see this a lot, the self-authorship pieces in advising, particularly in career advising, where students are starting to explore, what do I want to be when I grow up, right? I don't know that anyone has an answer to that question. I feel like with me, I'm like, I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this. But it's all about writing their own story. What do they want to do, and how do they get there? How do they get to that point? What do they need to do to grow and develop and become that person they want to be? Then there's Schlossberg's transition theory. Schlossberg defines transition as any event or non-event that results in a change. And a non-event, I think a good example as we're talking about college students is students who applied and were expecting to get into their first choice school, and then they didn't. So now they have to make a plan B. Right? They were expecting to get there and then they didn't. So that's the non-event. I was expecting this thing to happen and then it didn't. Non-event. And so what Schlossberg is saying is that in this transition theory, your ability to cope with change relies on the resources that you have within the 4 S's or the 4 stages of this theory, which includes situation, self-support, and strategies. And we're going to work through an example with that one a little bit later as well. But we use this a lot with first-year students, but there's plenty of other populations of students and people in general that experience transition, right? Like everyone in college in March experienced a transition to remote learning very abruptly, right? Faculty and staff also experienced that transition. Everyone's experienced a transition at a different time, but what they're doing within that situation, self-support and strategies is going to impact their ability to cope with that transition and how well and effectively they can cope with that transition. I also see Schlossberg used a lot and really effectively with military who are leaving the military world and transitioning either to civilian life or to education in general, right? Higher education, taking classes, what the expectations are in that experience is going to be a little bit different from their experience in their active service. So we see that a lot with, used a lot with military and veteran students. And then our last areas are social identity development theories like racial identity development, sexual identity development, gender identity development. There's actually a ton of specific theories and theorists under each of those areas. So I didn't list them all here, but they generally fall into these three. And that's largely because of the evolution of information. We're continuously doing new studies and we want to see how folks are developing their identities in different ways. And remember, our research in student development theory is generally based off of a specific population. So as we are learning more about identity development, we are finding more and more nuanced populations that we need to better understand. So we're continuing to do more and more research. I finished grad school about 10 years ago, and the number of identity development theories that have come out since then, I hadn't even heard of them until a couple of years ago. So there's tons and tons of growth in this area. One of the visuals that I really like to use for this, I'm going to warn you, it's very colorful, but I love it. So fun, is this student development transit system map. It looks really like all over the place and kind of confusing. But if you've ever navigated a subway or a bus route or anything like that, hopefully this looks familiar to you. It does give you a little bit of a legend there, and this is not all inclusive. Again, this is from several years ago, so I'm sure there have been more theories that have been developed, as well as some that have been decommissioned from our transit system map. So I really like this because I think it helps us to navigate and to draw parallels between the many different types of theories that exist. And it can help to highlight some of the relationships and cross-sectionals of the different theories. I think it can be really helpful in that way. I am going to drop into the chat. If I can get to my screen, hold on. The link to the cheat sheet. I literally just Googled it, a student development theory cheat sheet. So you can always find it there. But it is right now, it's just in a Google Doc. So hopefully you can see it. If not, just comment in the chat and I'll try to open that up for you. But it's a great little cheat sheet to kind of help break down some of the more common student development theories that we see used in higher ed. Again, look at the transit map. If there's any in particular you're interested in learning more about, Google it. Google Scholar has so many student development theory plus advising plus tutoring plus career plus whatever else that you want to look for. You can find tons of articles and research in just Google Scholar. Plus, I'm sure the library databases will have plenty too. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. One, because I need some water. And two, we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about the framework for designing programs and assessment using student development theory. But before we do that, I want to make sure that all of your questions are answered. Make sure we're all kind of good on the same page. What questions do you have? Light bulbs? aha moments? You can unmute, type them in the chat. Okay, if you have questions as they come up, I think generally where we run into the wait a minute is in the application piece. So we will get to that. If you have questions, just again, chat them, unmute yourself, and I'm just trying to move my, there we go, okay. All right, so student development theory is great. We should use it. How? How do we use that then in designing our programs and our assessment? Trying to absorb it all. It is a lot. I apologize. You'll also get my contact information at the end. So feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. I can help kind of guide it. So I am going to start out with the assessment cycle, because anyone working in assessment will tell you that the most effective programs and services always stem from the assessment cycle. And it's not because we have a bias for assessment. We do. We love assessment. We love evidence. We love data. But it's because we see it in the evidence and the data that when we start with the assessment cycle, those programs do a better job of achieving their outcomes and for demonstrating the success of their programs when they start with this framework. And that's why we have a bias for it, because we know it works, because we know it's effective. So the assessment cycle, for those who aren't familiar with it, is designed to guide our programs and services by reminding us of our purpose on campus, which is our mission, the greater contribution that we have to the student experience, which are our goals, and then what students will specifically get out of their interactions with us, which is our outcomes. We're always starting with the end in mind, right? We're always starting with, why are we going to do something? What is it we want students to know? What skills do we want them to have? What behaviors or habits do we want them to exhibit? What do we want them to change? What do we want them to stop doing? What are these pieces that we're trying to achieve? And then we design the programs, the services, the experiences, the activities, and all of the other things to help us achieve those outcomes. So they're intentionally designed to achieve the outcomes. That might seem like cheating to some. That's okay. That's what we're trying to do. We are cheating. We're saying, this is what we want you to experience. So we're going to design this program to make sure you experience them. And we're going to use student development theory to determine what we want you to experience. So we're kind of minimizing our bias in that. Saying, we really want you to identify this career and really understand strengths or whatever. Yes, we want you to do those things, but it's because we have some theory and some evidence and some research to tell us why that's important and why you would likely want to do that. From there, we either choose our methods or we create methods that are going to help us determine whether or not the activity, program, service, whatever we did with that student achieved the outcome that we created based off the theory. So it's this whole like nice framework, nice and flowy, everything is aligned and connected. And so because we're going to start with the end in mind and begin with the outcomes, I just want to make sure we all have a similar framework for outcomes and a basic understanding of that. If you've worked with the assessment folks on campus, I trust that you have strong knowledge in that because they're amazing, because I was one of them and I know them and they are all wonderful people. But outcomes in general are what we write down. We write it down. We don't store it up here. We don't talk about it with people and then leave the meeting and never write it down. We write it down. It's a challenge we have on our campus at CU. We write down what our program is, what desired impact that program is going to have on our students. So it's taking those broader goals and it's breaking them out into really specific, measurable, observable elements or results for that experience. And that shows up in one of two ways. One is a learning outcome. Not everything is a learning outcome. A learning outcome is where students learn something. It is stating what you want students to learn for a new concept, what skills you want them to have developed, what behaviors you want them to have learned how to exhibit as a result of participating in whatever interaction with your area or your program. Basically, everything else is a process outcome or an objective. We kind of use that language interchangeably. And that is where they're not learning something, but they might be doing something, or they might have a reflection on an experience. Yeah, Sylvia, I can make sure everyone gets a copy of the PowerPoint. So I'm sorry, I should have said that at the beginning so you didn't have to like worry about taking notes, but yes, you can get a copy. So the process outcome is looking at things like satisfaction. How, on a scale of 1 to 6, how satisfied are you with your experience in this? How many people showed up to this event or this activity? Where do you all think, in looking at learning and process outcomes, where do you think sense of belonging fits? Is it a learning outcome or is it a process outcome? I feel like this is a very philosophical question. Do we have any philosophy faculty in the group? Is Bruce here? Is Bruce in the group? Any thoughts?
He was signed up for it. He must have
not
had time. I know, this would have been a great one.
Right? Both. Process. Both. All right. Well, there's only one correct answer. Alyssa nailed it. It is a process outcome. And we see it as a process outcome because you can develop a sense of belonging. Absolutely. You can develop a feeling of whether or not you belong to a group of people, right? That's generally what we're talking about with belonging, or even mattering. You can feel like you matter, you can feel like you belong, but can you learn how to belong? Can you learn how to matter, right? There's factors that contribute to that feeling, but we don't actually learn new knowledge or new skills to develop in that area. So when we're talking about outcomes, our sense of belonging or our sense of mattering or our sense of connection, how well we fit in, those are all process outcomes. Still very important, as what we've already talked about. Students aren't engaging and they're not learning through their engagement because they don't feel like they matter, so they don't want to get involved. So process outcomes are still very important, just a little bit different from learning outcomes. So it's my trick question for you all. Great job. So let's take a moment and talk about how we write our outcomes, because that is where we're starting with our student development theory. Generally, student development theory, it is student focused, and the majority of the work that we do is using learning outcomes because we're wanting students to develop in some way. So we want them to grow, to learn new knowledge, to learn a new skill set, to be able to even reflect on something, right? Those are all skills that we want them to exhibit, or behaviors we want them to exhibit. So when we're writing outcomes, they are generally, not always, but generally written student focused as learning outcomes. Learning outcomes follow a really simple formula. This SWIBAT, students will be able to, or sometimes people switch out the will with the with should. Students should be able to, students will be able to. Every outcome starts like that. Students will be able to insert your Bloom's taxonomy verb from your hierarchy of critical thinking. So identify, articulate, describe, analyze, judge, summarize, create, write, whatever. Add on the activity. What is it that you want them to actually do? And then finish with your condition. Some people also start with the condition, which is usually as a result of participating in whatever the program experience activity is. So an example, looking at new student orientation, students will be able to, our Bloom's taxonomy verb is identify. 2 resources to support their success is the activity, and our condition is as a result of participating in new student orientation. So that's one example. To make sure we're all comfortable with this before we move into like, okay, now let's attach these to theory. I want to take a moment for you all to practice writing a learning outcome. Pop it into the chat. You can send it to me privately if you don't want to share it with everyone, if you're concerned about being evaluated or judged in any way. I'm not judging. It's a good practice opportunity. Think of it as following Kolb's experiential learning theory. You are diving right into the experience. So I want you to think about a program, a service, an activity that you do, an interaction that you have with students. What's a conversation you've had with a student in the last week or 2 weeks or month or this semester? Write a learning outcome that follows the formula. Students will be able to insert your Bloom's taxonomy, insert your activity as a result of participating in. Awesome, Brooke. That's great. As a result of attending a new student advising session, students will be able to define a short or long-term academic or career goal. Awesome. Great example. Yes, great. Good one, Amy. I know you sent that to me privately, but good job. I'll give you all a minute to do this. Oh, Ashley, I love that one. As a result of participating in the ASHE Global Sustainability Conference, students will be able to create a SMART goal to a sustainability practice they aim to put in place. Love that. As a result of participating in career services assessment, students should be able to identify 3 career occupation types that to their specific profile. Yes. Yay, Sylvia, I like it. Awesome, great. Okay, are we feeling comfortable? Are we feeling good about our outcomes a little bit? SLOs for the win. I love my learning outcomes. They're so fun. When in doubt, go back to your outcomes. If things aren't working the way you want them to, go back to your outcomes. Just start there. Start there. See if it makes sense. Feel free to keep tossing them in. I'm going to kind of shift us over just for the sake of time into designing our outcomes in our programs. How do we put all of this stuff together? First things first, we need to review our student development theory. We got to pick a theory to work with, right? Again, if you're not sure, Google Scholar, student development theory, plus whatever your field is. You'll see a lot of examples, even if it's just like, oh, we use this theory. What's also great is you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. There's a lot of amazing examples out there. I've seen a lot of great ones with advising based off of Chickering's model. Like I said, conduct and conduct models using moral development theory. If you work with first-year students a lot, Schlossberg's transition theory is a great one. If you're not sure where to start, check out the cheat sheet, reflect back on some of the slides in here, or email me and say, I have no idea where to start. This is what I do. And I can at least give you a couple of suggestions of where to get started. But we're gonna first look at a theory, decide on one, pick one, and then review more theories, because oftentimes the theory that we're using was built upon another theory's framework. So for example, the Kohlberg's moral development theory that we've been talking about is based on Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So to truly understand the moral development, we'll probably want to look a little bit more into Piaget's cognitive development and better understand that one. I'm not going to dive into those theories, just an example. So then what we're going to do is write everything down in a way that makes sense and organizes and clearly aligns our theory stage with our outcomes, with our activities, and our assessment method. For me, that looks something like this. I'm a tables person. Clearly, I work in assessment. I play with data. I love Excel. I do a lot of tables. I just like to see how everything aligns. For some folks, this is stressful and they are free thinkers and they want to mind map and bubble chart and do all whatever works for you. For today, we're going to follow this one, and then you can make it look as pretty and fun as you would like. But essentially, this is what we're going to do. We're going to write down 5 things. We're going to choose our theory. And in that first column, we're going to make a list of all of the stages, vectors, dimensions, types, steps, whatever is included in that theory. For the next column, we're going to write a description or some characteristics, basically a narrative about what is expected to happen at each of those stages or vectors, dimensions, whatever. I'm just going to call them stages for the purpose of this. So we're going to write a narrative for each of those stages. Our next column is where we write our outcomes. We're going to look at that vector, that stage, what's supposed to happen, and say, okay, based off of, I'm doing this for, it's something in I don't know, I'm going to pick tutoring because that's what I know. For tutoring, for academic support, I'm going to write an outcome that aligns with this stage for students. Now, remember, we don't have to do outcomes for all of the stages. The nature of our work might just focus on one particular or 2 or 3 of 7 different stages that exist. We can pick how many we need, but we want to be really specific. The outcome is for that specific stage. And then in our next column, we're going to define if this is a result of a training. I'm going to give an example soon of how I've used this in tutor training. What's the training, the activity, the experience, the interaction? What is that experience going to be like with the student that's going to help you achieve the outcome for that stage? And then from there, you'll choose or create an assessment method that's specific for assessing that stage. Now, a couple of things to note about the assessment method. I think when we're doing this, we all tend to, or many of us, tend to get stuck in, okay, I need to know right in this moment whether or not they are able to achieve this outcome. Realistically, most of student development doesn't happen within 5 minutes or a 20-minute conversation or a 2-hour workshop or a semester-long class or even 4 years of a bachelor's degree. It doesn't necessarily happen in that vacuum. So being mindful of what is it that we're trying to achieve here and how and when should I measure it is what we need to include in that assessment method. So am I looking at a formative assessment where in the experience, during the activity, during the interaction, I am going to assess whether or not they learned it? Am I going to do a summative where I'm waiting until the end of their advising appointment, or I'm waiting until the end of their tutoring session, I'm waiting until the end of their class to have them reflect on their experience and assess whether or not we achieve that outcome? Or am I doing a long-term summative assessment where I am allowing some time to pass between my interactions with the student to determine whether or not we achieve that outcome after they interacted with me? And so honestly, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just being mindful of how realistically can a student develop. Could you give some examples for classroom instructors, COVID style? Oh my gosh, yes. Linda, yes. We will come back to that in just a second. And you can probably do this in a little bit of what I'm going to talk about with the Kolb's piece. So I'm going to talk about an example with that soon. Yes. So this is the framework. This is it. This is all we do. That's how we align it. So we'll talk through some examples. Any questions about the framework, anything that doesn't quite make sense? Any thoughts around this? Feeling good? Okay, I'm gonna keep jumping. All right, so the example that I wanna give you all is from when my background before assessment was in academic support. So for those of you that I don't know, and I haven't worked with it at Pikes Peak, I was actually the director of the Learning Assistance Center there before it transitioned to the Learning Commons. And then I moved to Connecticut and established and grew some of the tutoring programs there at a university in Connecticut. So my background is really in academic support. I've taught first-year experience classes. We've done a whole lot of stuff with academic support, tutoring, supplemental instruction, all of the stuff. Anything you could do with academic support, I've been there. I realized when I first started working in the Learning Assistance Center at Pikes Peak, our training was, to give you some context, it was about 3 days long, and it was death by PowerPoint. And we had usually between like 20 and 40 tutors that were coming, and they were coming, the same tutors. It was required for everyone every single year. And there was no like adjustment in it because we needed everyone to know the same things to get started. And we all just stood there and presented by PowerPoint. So what I found in doing that was that our tutors were doing a great job of filling out their survey at the end of training and telling me all the steps of the tutoring cycle and telling me I can use probing questions to have a more effective communication with my student. But when it came time to them actually applying that in a tutoring session, in a space where I needed to see them demonstrate that they could follow the tutoring cycle, that they could ask appropriate questions, they could use Socratic questioning, they could do probing questions or whatever was needed, they could offer appropriate learning strategies for students. They weren't able to apply it. We were missing that component. So their performance during the semester, almost everyone was getting like a needs improvement in their like rubric, observation rubric. And so I was like, I know I'm not that strict of a supervisor. I challenge them. Like I like to think adequate challenge and support, but something's missing. So I went back to the training and I said, we need to find a way to make this more engaging. So we built it using Kolb's experiential learning. And this is also a prime example of how you don't have to use everything in a theory. We focused on just this ring around the outside, this 4 steps in the learning cycle. We kind of ignored everything in the middle of our perception and processing continuums and the 4 learning styles. That wasn't really our focus. Our focus was on how are they learning it in a way that they can effectively apply it in a tutoring session. When I ended up going to Connecticut, I had about 75 tutors working for me at any point in time. That's a lot of people to manage and to observe. I needed to make sure that they could do their jobs well and independently of me having to like listen in and be like, are they doing this right? Are they giving them answers? What's going on? I had to make sure that they could do it well because that improved the effectiveness of our program, the effectiveness of their tutoring with students, and the effectiveness of student learning from that tutoring experience. So it all started from Kolb's. So how we broke this down is looking at the 4 stages, the 4 steps of the learning cycle. So I'll kind of walk through this. And I think this is where, Linda, I think the challenge is with the COVID style, right? With the remote, but if you can use breakout rooms, I think this is where we can start to apply some of that. So in looking at these 4 steps, we have the first one, which is concrete experience. This is where students are actively participating in an experience. They're actively trying to do the thing that we want them to learn in the first place. One of the skills that was necessary for our tutors to really develop was the ability to ask appropriate probing questions from students within their tutoring session. So that was the outcome that I set for this. My tutors will be able to demonstrate probing questioning techniques. Great, I want to make sure that they can do it before they have to go out and actually do it. The activity that we did for this, notice I didn't just say training, yes, training, but very specific. Beginner level role play scenario during tutor training. What this meant was the new tutors were given a scenario where you have a student coming to your tutoring session who doesn't understand their homework. The most commonly asked question, most common challenge that students run into coming to tutoring. They don't understand their homework. Go, help them, tutor them. That's it, that's all they're given. Very simple, they don't understand it. The point of this wasn't that they helped the student get the answer. The point of this for me was to determine, can they ask enough and appropriate probing questions of the students to help understand what students do know what they don't know and help to connect those gaps. That's what I was trying to see. That's the outcome that I'm trying to see. Not like, can you actually finish this session? I'm not looking at tutoring cycle. I'm not looking at anything else. I'm looking at the probing questions. So they got a scenario that they had to role play. And I always tagged my experienced tutors to role play, or the more knowledgeable tutors that maybe haven't tutored in the center before, but they have tutoring experience elsewhere. I always tag them to play the students because they know what the student is actually going to ask and how they're actually going to answer it. They've been there, they've been through that. So that was my activity. My assessment method was I sat in the back of the room and observed them, usually with a rubric or a checklist to say like, yeah, they could ask probing questions, or it was okay. They asked some were kind of closed-ended, some didn't really get anywhere, or I'd make an actual list of the questions that they asked. But that was the first step. The students role played. Step 2 was this reflective observation, where students reflect on the experience without judgment. They're not analyzing, they're not critiquing at this stage. All they're doing for me, for this outcome, was that they could identify the probing questions that they used in their tutoring session. And this was in a post-role play debrief. So they role played their beginner session, and then we debriefed on that. We had a conversation. I asked them to share with me and the group, the rest of the tutors, orally, generally, summarize what just happened in that session. What were the probing questions that you used? That's it. That's all I want to see. Can you reflect on that and can you identify them? Now we're going to move into abstract conceptualization. Students create concepts that integrate theories for future application. This is where they start to critique and they start to analyze the effectiveness of the probing questions that they use during their role play. Again, this happens in a role play debrief. They role play, they tell us, this is what happened, here are the questions that I used. And we say, okay, how effective were those? Which ones worked better than others? Are there other questions that you could have asked? This is also where I usually pull in the feedback from other new tutors and then more experienced tutors who have maybe a little bit more skill in this area, or if you have a student leader position, you can pull them in. I always had lead tutors on my staff who provided a lot of feedback for them. The assessment was an oral discussion. And again, I almost always have a rubric or a checklist with me. It's easier than trying to scribble notes all the time. If I know exactly what I'm looking for, I'm just going to list it and check things off. It's so much easier assessment-wise. So we've analyzed it. We've discussed, okay, here are some things some questions that could work better than others. Then we move into active experimentation. And this is where the students, the tutors, are testing the theories by making decisions and solving problems. They've decided I could ask better questions in this way. Next time I ask this question, I'm going to frame it differently. And here's why, like thinking through that process. So now my outcome is that tutors will incorporate varied probing questions that effectively assess student understanding of course material. This is ultimately the outcome that I have for a training on using probing questions. But notice that's not where I started from. I started from, they can demonstrate using probing questions. Not well, but they can do it. They can ask a probing question. It just might not be the right one. It might not be what's effective. It might have not helped them get to where they wanted to be, but they can do it. And so for this one, I had 2 activities. One, I gave them more advanced or intermediate level role plays for them to practice in the tutor training. Again, standing by with my observation, my checklist. And then we went through that whole cycle over again. We did the reflective observation, the abstract conceptualization, because they're continually refining. They're learning at every one of those stages. And then my second activity for this was observing them in their active tutoring sessions. It's great if they can do it during training, but my challenge before was that they weren't applying it. They weren't using that in their tutoring sessions. And so I wanted to make sure they could do it there. So that was the second place that I observed with a rubric, among other things. I observed other things during that time, but I had my rubric there to determine how effectively they could do that. And guess what? The second I started involving them in an experiential learning process of how to develop these probing questioning techniques in this skill set, their ability to do that during training grew like exponentially. They did so much better with students. Yes, I still had some that would lean back and just talk at students and tell them, here's what you need to do. Yes, still had those folks. But overall, their skill set grew so much more. And the questions they were asking were so much more thoughtful and really helped to get to the root of what does the student actually know? What are they supposed to know? And how do we bridge those gaps? Which is rooted in other learning theory, Vygotsky's theory of proximal development and all kinds of other stuff, if you want to get into all that. But it's rooted in other areas. So I knew that if they could really improve in this technique, they could do so much better in the setting. And that's what ended up happening just by making that one shift in how they learned the process. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're gonna keep moving. If you have questions, toss them in the chat and I'll try to keep an eye on them. I wanna make sure that we have some time to talk through some case studies. So I'm gonna skip one activity. But for this one, we're gonna break out into some groups, into some breakout rooms. How many folks do we have, Ashley?
There's 20, but that includes you, so 19 participants.
Okay. Why don't we just do 2 groups, which is going to be larger than what I normally do, but we have 2 case studies and they're a little bit different. So I want to make sure we have time to get to both. So I'm going to read through the case studies. I'm also going to put a link in the chat. So we'll send it to the chats in the group or broad message them, whatever we have to do. And so you can see the theory and you'll have your own mapping grid to work from. So the 2 case studies we're going to work through. Schlossberg's transition theory. If anyone hasn't figured it out, Schlossberg is my favorite theorist. I love her. Schlossberg's transition theory. The case study, the scenario. You are designing a workshop to help new students understand how to be successful during their first semester at PPCC when their classes and co-curricular involvement has been adapted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what you're going to do is use Schlossberg's transition theory, and the link that we're going to share with you all has more details about the theory, as well as the grid that already has, I think it has all of the stages and all of the characteristics already filled in for you. So you're going to use this theory to write at least one outcome for the workshop, at least one specific activity that you would do in the workshop, and at least one assessment method for determining the extent to which that activity achieved that outcome. And you're going to tie that to Schlossberg's theory. Okay. And then the other group will get mattering and marginality, also a Schlossberg theory. In this one, you are conducting outreach to vulnerable students who are considered high risk of not successfully completing the semester due to their academic performance. You could be staff, you could be faculty reaching out to your students in your class, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter your role, this is what you're doing. So you're going to use the theory of mattering and marginality to, again, write at least one outcome, develop your outreach activity. What does your activity look like? What's the interaction going to be like? What are the types of topics you're going to talk about in your conversation? And describe your assessment method for determining whether you achieved your outcome for at least one of those stages. Does that sound good? Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to post the links in the chat first. This one is, oh, hold on. I'm sending to someone privately. That's not what I want to do. Okay, this first one is your marginality and mattering. So I'm gonna have you open up both of them because I don't know which room you're gonna end up in. But you'll talk amongst yourselves as a group. So as a group, you can develop one outcome, one activity. If you wanna do more than that, great, but you don't have to. So there's the first one. And then the second is the Schlossberg one.